Okay, guys, so here we are, the nervous system, so specifically the brain. You hopefully have just listened to the podcast about the nervous system, and now we're going to talk specifically about the brain. The brain is divided into four major regions: the cerebrum, the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. The cerebrum is the largest portion. It's this right here. Thick ridges called gyri mark its surface. You can see here the ridges. And then shallow grooves called sulci divide the gyri. Deep sulci are called fissures. The diencephalon sits between the cerebrum and the midbrain. It's in here. It's kind of inside. That's why it's kind of shown kind of as see-through. It's really inside. You can't see it from outside. The cerebellum, that's the second largest region of the brain. Even though it's the second largest, it contains more neurons than the rest of the brain combined. And then the brainstem makes up the rest of the brain. And again, it's part of that's inside, so it's hard to see it. And the brainstem has three parts to it, of course. The midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. There is a deep groove called the longitudinal fissure that divides the cerebrum into right and left cerebral hemispheres. And there's a thick bundle of nerves called the corpus callosum that runs along the bottom of the fissure, and that serves to connect the two sides, kind of like east meets west. The brain contains gray matter and white matter. Gray matter covers the cerebrum and the cerebellum in a layer called the cortex. That's what controls thought, learning, and reasoning. Surface folds in that allow more gray matter to be packed into the skull because the folds increase the surface area, obviously. Remember with the spinal cord we talked about the meninges. There are meninges of the brain. Again, dura mater, arachnoid matter, and pia mater cover the brain. The dura mater consists of two layers, of course. The outer layer, or the periosteal layer, that's attached to the inner surface of the skull, and then the inner meningeal layer forms the outer covering of the brain and continues as the dura mater of the spinal cord. The dura mater separates to create spaces called dural sinuses. These sinuses collect blood that has passed through the brain and is on its way back to the heart. There's a subdural space that separates the dura from the arachnoid matter, and a subarachnoid space that separates the arachnoid from the pia mater, or pia mater, however you want to say it. I don't know if you've heard people who've had like a subdural hematoma or a subarachnoid hemorrhage. That's the spaces that it's happening in. In some places, the dura mater extends inward and separates major portions of the brain. The falx cerebri dips into the longitudinal fissure to separate the right and left hemispheres. In other places, the tentorium cerebella extends over the top of the cerebellum and separates it from the cerebrum. There are ventricles in your brain. They're like kind of like chambers. 4 of them, 2 lateral. These ones arch through the cerebral hemispheres, one in the right and one in the left. And then each of the lateral ventricles connects to a third ventricle. A canal leads to the 4th ventricle. This space is narrow. This space narrows to form the central canal, which extends through the spinal cord. There's a clear colorless fluid called cerebrospinal fluid that fills these ventricles and the central canal. It also bathes the outside of the brain and the spinal cord. The choroid plexus in each lateral ventricle is what secretes the central cerebrospinal fluid. This fluid constantly flows through the central nervous system. It provides nourishment in the form of glucose and protein. It removes metabolic waste, and it cushions the brain against minor trauma. The brain monitors the level of CO2 in the cerebrospinal fluid, and that triggers responses to help the body maintain homeostasis. CSF production happens in a series of steps. The choroid plexus in each lateral ventricle secretes this cerebrospinal fluid. That fluid flows into the 3rd ventricle, where the choroid plexus in that ventricle adds even more. And then it all flows into the 4th ventricle, where even more CSF is added by the choroid plexus located there. Some of it flows through 2 tiny openings, foramina, and from there the CSF flows through the subarachnoid space, up the back of the brain, down around the spinal cord, and up the front of the brain. It's then reabsorbed into the venous bloodstream by projections of the arachnoid matter into the dural sinuses. Complicated steps, and you can see all the steps listed here, starting with 1. I'm not going to expect you to know all of those steps. What I want you to know is that it's the choroid plexus and the ventricles that actually makes that cerebrospinal fluid, and that it's that fluid that helps to protect the brain. So the different parts of the brain stem consists of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. Lots of times you'll hear people just say the medulla, they don't include the oblongata part of it. It contains tracts that relay sensory and motor impulses. It also, this is the midbrain. The midbrain contains tracts that relay sensory and motor impulses. It also contains centers for auditory and visual reflexes, so hearing and seeing reflexes, as well as clusters of neurons integral to muscle control. The pons contains tracts that convey signals to and from different parts of the brain. Several cranial nerves arise from this area. And then the medulla oblongata is what attaches the brain to the spinal cord. This relays sensory and motor signals between the brain and the spinal cord. It also contains the cardiac center, which regulates the heart rate, the vasomotor center, which controls blood vessel diameter, and in that way it affects blood pressure, and 2 respiratory centers, which regulate breathing. So your medulla is a pretty important little piece of your brain. The medulla also houses reflex centers for coughing, sneezing, swallowing, and vomiting, and several cranial nerves either begin or end in the medulla. The cerebellum. The cerebellum houses more neurons than the rest of the brain combined. It's this part down here. It's connected to the cerebral cortex by about 40 million neurons. The cerebellum receives and processes messages from all over the brain. It monitors body movements and sends messages for balance, coordination, and posture. It stores information necessary for muscle groups to work together to perform smooth, efficient, coordinated movements. And it evaluates sensory input such as touch, spatial perception, the perception of what's around you, and sound. People with a cerebellar dysfunction have a spastic gait, poor balance, jerky movements, and tremors. They also tend to have poor impulse control and tend to overreact emotionally to things. The diencephalon, this is deep inside the brain. That's why on the picture it's hard to show it on the picture, but it's shown right here in this picture. It really consists of several structures, but the chief ones, the ones I want you to know about, are the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The thalamus is shaped like 2 eggs. It resides right on top of the brainstem, and it acts as a gateway for nearly every sensory impulse traveling to the cerebral cortex. The thalamus processes these impulses, it filters out, and it only lets some of them through. Not all of them get through to the cerebral cortex. Probably a good thing. You've heard of sensory overload. Sounds like that would probably happen if we didn't have our thalamus there. It also relays messages regarding certain complex movements, and it's involved in memory and emotion. The hypothalamus is really tiny, but it influences nearly every organ of the body. It controls the autonomic nervous system. It contains the centers for hunger, thirst, and temperature regulation. It controls the pituitary gland. We're going to learn about that with the endocrine system. And it's involved in multiple emotional responses, including fear, anger, pleasure, and aggression. There's a set of interconnected nuclei called the reticular formation that's scattered throughout the brainstem. Fibers extend from there to the cerebrum, to the cerebellum, and to the spinal cord. One component of this formation is the reticular activating system. This system receives input from the eyes and the ears, filters out insignificant signals like routine noise, and it sends impulses to the cerebral cortex so the mind remains conscious and alert. Drugs that depress the reticular activating system help you fall asleep. The reticular formation also has tracts extending into the spinal cord that are involved in posture and equilibrium. Other components of the reticular formation include the cardiac and vasomotor centers of the medulla, and those are responsible for the heart rate and the blood pressure. The cerebrum, this is the largest portion of the brain. This whole part is the cerebrum. It's divided, of course, more subdivisions into 5 lobes. These lobes are named for the bones of the skull that lie directly over them. So remember I said with these skeletal systems, if you learn the names of the bones there, it's going to help you with the names of the lobes of the brain later. The frontal lobe, right in the front, this is what governs voluntary movements, memory, emotion, social judgment, decision-making, reasoning, and aggression. It's also the site for certain aspects of one's personality. So people who have a stroke in the frontal lobe of their brain, their personality could change. I've seen that happen a couple times. The parietal lobe, this one right here, it's a nice blue color. Dad's jobs are concerned with receiving and interpreting bodily sensations like touch, temperature, pressure, and pain. It also governs proprioception. Proprioception, if you're not aware, usually I tell you just look stuff up when you have questions like that. But proprioception is the awareness of one's body and body parts in space in relation to each other. So that's what helps you know where your hands are and where your feet are. The occipital lobe, here in the back, right underneath the occipital bone, that's concerned with analyzing and interpreting visual information. The temporal lobe, right here, that's the one that governs hearing, smell, learning, memory, emotional behavior, and visual recognition. And then the insula, hidden behind the lateral sulcus, it's hard to see. They have this picture here that kind of has pulled part of the brain apart for you. That plays a role in a lot of different functions, including perception, motor control, self-awareness, and cognitive function. Inside the cerebrum, most of it is white matter, bundles of myelinated nerve fibers called tracts. These tracts carry impulses from one part of the cerebrum to the other, or from the cerebrum to other parts of the brain or spinal cord. Most tracts passing from one hemisphere to the other travel through the corpus callosum. Remember that bundle of tracts through the middle? And this allows the two hemispheres of the brain to communicate with each other. The surface of the cerebrum, or the cerebral cortex, that's a thin layer of gray matter. It says thin layer, but then it says gray matter makes up about 40% of the brain's mass. So it doesn't really sound like it's such a thin layer. Masses of gray matter called basal nuclei or basal ganglia lie deep within the cerebrum, and they play a role in the control of movement. Other tracts carry information back and forth between the brain and the spinal cord. These really are their extensions of the ascending tracts from the spine and the descending tracts from the spine. These tracts cross in the brainstem, which is why the right side of the brain is sending impulses to the left side of the body, and the left side of the brain is sending impulses to the right side of the body. The limbic system, that's where your emotions are. That's the seat of emotion and learning. It's formed by a complex set of structures that encircle the corpus callosum and the thalamus. It links areas of the lower brain stem. Remember, that's the part that controls automatic functions, with areas in the cerebral cortex that are associated with higher mental functions. Two key structures of the limbic system are the hippocampus and the amygdala. The hippocampus is crucial for memory and learning, and the amygdala is concerned with emotions. It stores and it can recall emotions from past events. Feelings of anger, fear, sorrow, and pleasure result because of a functioning limbic system. Other parts of the cerebral cortex must also be engaged to ensure that those feelings are expressed in socially acceptable ways. Sensory functions of the cerebral cortex. Sensory nerve fibers transmit signals up through the spinal cord to the thalamus, which then sends them on to the postcentral gyrus. The postcentral gyrus is the primary somatic sensory area of the brain. This is where signals of heat, cold, and touch from receptors all over the body go. The right postcentral gyrus receives signals from the left side of the body, and the left gyrus receives signals from the right side. The somatic sensory association area allows us to pinpoint the location of pain, identify a texture, and be aware of how our limbs are positioned. There are motor functions of the cerebral cortex. The primary somatic motor area is the precentral gyrus. Neurons in the motor association area determine which movements are required to perform a specific task, and then sends the appropriate signals to the precentral gyrus. The neurons in the precentral gyrus then send the impulses through the motor tracts in the brainstem and the spinal cord to the skeletal muscles so that movement can occur. There is a sequence of events that are required in order to be able to read out loud. The written words stimulate the primary visual cortex. I'm not going to expect you to know these steps, so I'm not going to really go through them a lot. There's Wernicke's area, that's where the words are formulated into phrases that comply with learned grammatical rules. And then Broca's area plans the muscle movements required of the larynx, tongue, cheeks, and lips to form the words. So that's really, you're not going to need to know too much about that. Special senses. There are different areas of your brain that are associated with the special senses. The primary gustatory complex handles interpretation and sensation of taste. The primary visual cortex is responsible for sight. It governs the recognition of size, color, light, motion, and dimension. Visual association area interprets the information acquired through the primary visual cortex, and that allows us to recognize familiar objects. Primary auditory complex. Auditory means that it's responsible for hearing. Auditory association area gives us the ability to recognize familiar sounds, like a person's voice. And then olfactory association area interprets the sense of smell. At the most, I'm going to expect you to just know what each one does. You don't need to know where they are in the brain. We're almost there, almost done. Cerebral lateralization. You've heard the left brain, right brain, and the left brain does certain things and the right brain does certain things. The left side of the brain, that's the more analytical side. It focuses on language and the types of reasoning used in math and science. And the right side is more concerned with creativity and spatial ability. It's kind of weird because I'm a little creative, but I can't do space. Knowing if something can fit into a space or anything like that is not something I can do. The two hemispheres connect via the corpus callosum. Remember, we've already talked about that. And this allows for smooth integration of information. Here is cranial nerves. There are 12 pairs of cranial nerves. I'm not going to expect you to know the names of all of them. What I want you to know is that there are 12 pairs of them. Some of them contain only sensory fibers, some contain primarily motor, and others contain both. They're identified by a name and a Roman numeral, beginning in the front of the brain and working back. And again, I'm not going to expect you to know the names of all of them, but just know that there are 12. So we've talked about the brain, the different regions of the brain, what the different regions do, and what things they control. We've also talked about cranial nerves. We've talked about emotions and special senses. Your brain's a pretty busy little thing. And that's it. Thanks. Look at that. I have a summary. And I didn't even know it. So I just did the summary with the previous slide of the things that we've talked about. And that's it.